Our topic this evening is who was James? And we just kind of specify in the Bible which James we're talking about. And so specifically, who was James, the brother of Jesus, which gives it away a little bit, but not entirely. I was thinking as I was preparing these slides today, that we sort of have talked about, maybe we've almost answered this or had this topic before, although we haven't had this particular lecture. And so I wanted to do maybe a previously on the Center Place lectures so that we can kind of look at how we've built on this topic before. So for example, we have done a lecture on the historical apostles. What can we know about the actual disciples, the 12 disciples that Jesus may or may not have picked, the historical Jesus, and then also the broader category of apostle in early Christianity. And so we saw there that there were many more than 12 apostles in even proto-Christianity, the movement that existed before the term Christianity was even coined. And as a result, that led to a real diversity in the early proto-Christian communities, the early churches. We had a lecture very recently on why Paul's churches won. So out of those diverse communities, why specifically Paul's interpretation about adherence to Jewish law or non-adherence to Jewish law won out. And so Paul's position was that Christians should no longer adhere to Jewish law, and then that defeated the rival position, which argued that no, they should, that it was important for people to convert essentially first to Judaism and obey Mosaic law, and then next they could become Christians, or in other words, it's part of the process. A long while back actually, we had a lecture on lost Christianities, where we talk about how when proto-Orthodox Christians, when their group essentially emerged as victorious, when their group became the state religion of the Roman Empire in the 4th century, how all of that diversity that had existed, including the Christian communities where it was still practiced that you had to adhere to Jewish law, how those became labeled as heresies and ultimately were eradicated. And then we've had a lecture also on some of the scriptures from those communities, the lost Gospels of the Hebrews, and how as a result of those not making it into the canon, only fragments today remain of these Gospels. So the Gospels of the Ebionites and the Nazarenes, the Gospel of the Hebrews, books that Jewish Christians considered Scripture, but were not considered Scripture. They were considered heretical texts by the Proto-Orthodox Church, which became the Imperial Church, the Nicene Church. So in the course of these lectures, we've talked about this model of a conflict in the middle 1st century and then in the 1st century generally between what's sometimes called the Pauline Church and the Jacobite Church, the Jamesian Church. This thesis, already was developed in the 19th century, so this has been around for a while in scholarship, and it's, as with any model like this, it's very oversimplified. But essentially the idea is that there is this central conflict over adherence to Jewish law, where the two churches or the two factions are split, and then what emerges in the 2nd and 3rd century is a synthesis that comes between them, where though the position on law, Paul's position on law, actually wins out. So we've said a bunch of times that whenever you have models like that, the models are too simple to describe the actual reality. And in fact, there would have been a diversity of early Christian communities that were planted by many, many more than 12 apostles. All of them looked to different leaders as authoritative in different times. And so actually we'll see many, many times Paul was an innovator who was going around and planting communities, and then he would lose control of them to Peter and other disciples that were connected, that had been connected to the historical Jesus, specifically ones that were also in agreement with the church led by James, the brother of Jesus, in Jerusalem. And so, and when we talked about lost Christianities, we talked about the perspective as it was traditionally taught, when we always say the victors write the history. So when the proto-Orthodox win and become the one Catholic and Orthodox Church, the Imperial Nicene Church, they look back on their history and redefine the Marcionites or the Ebionites, the Christians who adhere to Jewish law, and also Gnostics and others as breakoffs from a church that was always intended to be Nicene, that was always Trinitarian, even though we've seen in other lectures that the idea of Trinity evolved during this time, and likewise that rejected a church that rejected from the start obedience or adherence to Jewish law, and saw anything other than that as a breakoff and as Judaizing, as opposed to a church that emerged out of a sect of Judaism where all of the members originally were adhering to some form of Jewish law. So instead of that traditional perspective, we have said, well, maybe in fact the original Jewish disciples of Jesus continued on in many cases in a church led by James, and some of their remnants in the 3rd and 4th centuries continued to be Jewish Christians who adhered to Jewish law, and as that group had been called the poor, which relates to the word Ebion in Hebrew, so the Ebionites, that group, that remnant, is part of that original tradition. And so in that sense, the communities that Paul started, which are ultimately maybe the basis of proto-Orthodoxy, can be seen more as the break-off from the original tradition, although even here it's way more complex than the simple diagram would allow, because in most cases, all of the churches that Paul planted, he ceded control of them to representatives of the Jamesian church, like Peter. And so, again, the church that emerged is a synthesis of both. So, as we're talking about James in English, I want to just dwell a little bit on the many Jameses and the use of the name James. So in most English translations of the New Testament, we use the word James for the Greek word Jakobos, the Greek name Jakobos. And that is actually the same name, Jakobos, that is found in English, that the English translates from the Old Testament Hebrew, Jacob, Jacob, and so we have it as Jacob. So Jacob, which we use as the name in the Old Testament by going through the Hebrew, is the same actual name as James. In other words, the one of them is going through Greek, and we use two different names, which is confusing. And so this is really similar to the fact that for the New Testament, we translate Jesus from, Jesus, and the same name is Yeshua or Yehoshua, which is we translate as Joshua. So Joshua and Jesus are actually the same name as well. And just to be clear also, I've also used Pauline when we're talking about that which is of or related to Paul. So Jacobite, because James and Jacob are the same name in this sense, Jacobite is an adjective meaning of or related to James, the Jamesian church, Jacobite or Jacobin church. All right. So, so which James? So we have a number of James. So on the official 12 apostle lists that are found in the Synoptic Gospels, there are a couple Jameses mentioned. James, the son of Zebedee, and James the son of Alphaeus, neither of which are James the brother of Jesus, who often has the epithet James the just, or that's sometimes translated James the righteous. And the implication, or he has that name according to tradition because of his virtue and also his zeal for the law. And so law here is going to be central. What is the position of these early Christian leaders on Mosaic law and whether Christians need to obey Levitical commandments and so on? So which James? Well, and which James, the first James is called James the Greater, and you'd think that people would be trying to compete for who gets to be James the Greater. Is it James the brother of Jesus, or is it James the son of Zebedee? James the son of Zebedee has a clear title to James the Greater, and so this is the Santiago, whose shrine is in Compostela, Spain, that people make a pilgrimage to, St. James the Greater. Actually, the other two Jameses compete for the title James the Less. So sometimes when you hear someone called James the Less, they're referring to James the brother of Jesus, and sometimes they're referring to the apostle James the son of Alphaeus. And sometimes people want to conflate them and figure out some way to make James the brother of Jesus be James the son of Alphaeus. For example, if after Jesus' father, Joseph, dies, if his mother Mary marries Alphaeus and she has more sons, that could be one way that he could have a brother who is also the son of Alphaeus. But that's just a later tradition of trying to conflate different Jameses. So what can we know about James, the brother of Jesus? As we've done in our lecture on the historical apostles, our capacity to identify apostles as being actual historical figures is pretty limited. But James, the brother of Jesus, James the Just, is an exception. So we're pretty clearly a historical apostle. He's identified as the brother of Jesus by Paul and also by Josephus. Paul talks about meeting him on more than one occasion. Paul, despite a serious rivalry with and disagreements with him, describes him as a pillar of the church and one of the acknowledged leaders of the church, of the proto-Christian community based in Jerusalem. So, like I say, the Jewish Roman historian Josephus also has a passage where he describes James's execution. And as we'll see, that is actually mostly an incidental. James is almost kind of incidentally mentioned. Josephus has got bigger fish to fry, and he is talking about Jerusalem and Judean politics in the year 62, when he describes James's death. He doesn't really care about James. What he's trying to show is that the high priest who has James killed, is sort of acting out of a political motivation because he has freedom to act for a very brief time, as we'll see. Another thing that points us to James, the New Testament book, the Epistle of James, has traditionally been attributed to him, although very few, the preponderance of scholars see the book now as pseudonymous, as not actually written by him, as we'll see. So decades before, Greek-speaking adherents to the movement, which later, before they even coined the word Christian, which according to the book of Acts happened in Antioch, the Roman capital of Syria, decades after Jesus' death. James' brother, Jesus of Nazareth, had been one of this movement's leaders, alongside other important leaders that are remembered, like John the Baptist. So some of John's sayings are preserved in both the Q sayings source and also in Mark and other sources, and the idea that John was an important ascetic leader and apocalyptic prophet who maybe is the person who repurposed Hebrew, the Second Temple Jewish purity ritual of mikveh bathing as baptism, a spiritual practice that ends up being adopted by and central to the proto-Christian movement. That is another important leader and martyred prophet in this sect of Second Temple Judaism that eventually emerges as the Christian religion. So Jesus led a following in his native Galilee, and it was especially centered around rural poor people, craftsmen, peasant farmers and fishermen, and so on. By the end of his life, Jesus relocated to Jerusalem, where he was executed by Roman officials, and that execution was unexpected by most of his disciples, and they were thrown into confusion when that happened. So, according to the first Christian whose writings survive, the Apostle Paul, who nevertheless converted to the movement a few years after Jesus' execution, everything of that time of confusion changed when male and female disciples of Jesus, people who are in that movement, began receiving visions. And so Paul writes in 1 Corinthians 15, "I handed on to you as of first importance what I in turn had received, that Christ died for our sins in accordance with the Scriptures, and that he was buried, and that he was raised on the third day in accordance with the Scriptures, and that he appeared to Cephas, appeared to Peter, and then to the 12, and then he appeared to more than 500 brothers and sisters at one time, most of whom are still alive, though some have died. Then he appeared to James, then to all the apostles, and last of all, as to one untimely born, he appeared also to me." So in Paul's understanding of the story, which he considers of first importance, the risen Christ appeared first to Cephas, to Peter, who is part of a group that Paul identifies as the 12. So that's our idea that there are 12 special apostles set aside, and it exists both in the different Gospels, but it's also here in Paul's understanding as well. The Gospels contradict this, Paul's understanding, because in all of the Gospel accounts, the risen Christ appears to the women first. So certainly anyway in Luke and Matthew and John, that the risen Christ appears first to the female disciples as opposed to Peter, although Peter's very early among the people who see the risen Christ. So the risen Christ in Paul's telling later appears to James, whom Paul lists along with all of the apostles. So in other words, not simply a group like the 12. We've had a whole lecture on apostles that shows that there were many more. The Gospel of Luke, for example, talks about an additional 70 apostles that are sent out as a symbolic number. So in between that, Paul talks about a mass vision that is shared by more than 500 female and male disciples. So for Paul, who was converted to this movement, he joined this movement because he independently had this kind of a vision of the risen Christ. These visions, these appearances were of first importance. That's what caused him to join. So for him, this is the starting point. However, what we don't always think about is that is not true for leaders of the movement up until that point, including disciples who, they were already part of this movement that the historical Jesus had led. So visions of the risen Christ are why Paul joined, but it wasn't why they had originally joined. And so there's a difference already right from the start in how both these groups see what the key component of this emerging religion. So disciples like Simon Bar Jonah, who is given this nickname that means rock, the rock, Cephas in Aramaic, Peter in Greek, or those are English versions of those. So Simon Peter might have felt, that the teachings of Jesus that Jesus had shared and taught to him in life that's what was of first importance. Or people in that group who had, let's say, given away all their possessions to the poor and followed Jesus might have felt that being part of a spirit-focused movement that renounced property, that rendered unto Caesar what is Caesar's, the kingdom of Caesar, and instead focused on God's kingdom, where the poor are blessed and theirs is the kingdom of God, where they, as mendicants, were begging and praying for their daily bread and operating like the birds and the lilies, that maybe that, being part of that kind of a mendicant spiritual community, almost like we think of Franciscan friars or Buddhist monks, that maybe that was the essence of the gospel. So even for disciples who experienced a vision of the risen Christ, they wouldn't have all shared the same interpretation of what does that vision mean. So for some of these, we can say that seeing a vision of Christ risen and sitting at God's right hand in heaven was a vindication of Jesus, who they saw as a prophet, whose testimony was sealed in blood, the same way the ancient prophets before him and also John the Baptist immediately before him. And so maybe they interpreted the vision that way. And even for those who saw that vision as confirming that Jesus is the Messiah, that Jesus is the Christ, that still has multiple interpretations. Paul's kind of final theological leap on that the Messiah is in fact Lord, that the Messiah is the Logos, or the glory of God, the seeable, God's glory made visible. In other words, a component or a person of the divine, of the unseeable creator. That's different from how many of them might have seen. The Messiah could simply be a son of God who is heralding some new era or the end times for God without being a person of God, equated with the Logos and so on. So let's look at some other details that Paul gives about James. And we've looked at this a little bit a few months ago, or so maybe a little over a month ago, when we were also looking at the Pauline churches and Paul's church and why Paul's churches won. But now I want to look at it from James's perspective, or from Paul's perspective on James. So Paul explains his version of his interactions with Cephas, with Peter, James, and John, in what is really a highly defensive letter to a Christian community that he himself had planted in Galatia. So people, presumably from unnamed rivals, have been calling Paul's credentials and teachings into question, presumably coming from Peter, James, and John, that community. So Paul says to the Galatians, I am astonished that you are so quickly deserting the one who called you in the grace of Christ. In other words, me, Paul, you are deserting me and are turning to a different gospel. And then he says, well, wait a second. There's not that there is another gospel, but there are some who are confusing you and who want to pervert the gospel of Christ. So the gospel that Paul teaches, his interpretation, is the only true gospel, and anything that these other people are teaching you, these some who have come and are confusing you, they are perverting the true gospel. Paul asserts, his interpretation comes through independent revelation. So there are rival sources of authority, he's saying. For I want you to know, brothers and sisters in Galatia, that the gospel that was proclaimed by me is not of human origin. For I didn't receive it from a human source, nor was I taught it. I didn't go to some class and have somebody present testimony and it's hearsay or something that I'm sharing with you. I received it through a revelation of Jesus Christ. So I have a direct spiritual connection to the risen Christ. The implication is, I think, that Paul's rivals are tracing their authority to direct connection to the community of disciples who followed Jesus of Nazareth during his lifetime. And in other places, he talks about people bringing essentially letters of recommendation. In other words, they having a certificate that says from the church in Jerusalem, presumably, that is saying these are the real apostles, and the fact that Paul doesn't have such a certificate, they're claiming shows that he is not a real apostle. He's not authorized by any of these human representatives of the church. Paul's saying, that doesn't matter. I don't need any of that kind of things. I'm getting this directly by revelation from Jesus Christ. So to explain how this situation arises, Paul shares a bunch of his backstory. He says, "You have heard, no doubt, of my earlier life in Judaism. I was violently persecuting the church of God, and I was trying to destroy it. I advanced in Judaism beyond many among my people of the same age, for I was far more zealous for the traditions of my ancestors. But when the one who had set me apart before I was born, God, called me through his grace and was pleased to reveal his Son to me, so that I might proclaim him among the Gentiles, I did not confer with any human," not some disciple of Christ that was running around and telling me about any of these things, "nor did I go up to Jerusalem to those who were already apostles before me." I didn't seek any authorization from these guys. I don't need it. "But I went away at once into Arabia, and afterward I returned to Damascus. Then, after 3 years, I did go up to Jerusalem to visit Cephas and stayed with him 15 days, but I did not see any other apostle except James, the Lord's brother. In what I am writing to you, before God, I do not lie." So Paul here swears that he formulated his ideas and began planting communities in Arabia. It's probably the Nabatean community around Damascus, so not too far probably from where he started out in Damascus, and then in Damascus, which is part of southern Syria, just beyond the Roman frontiers at this time, and that he was doing that for about 3 years before even conferring with any other established apostle in the proto-Christian movement. Paul also indicates in this section that Cephas and James are based in Jerusalem, at least they were there when he got there, and that he met them. And he further identifies James as the Lord's brother. So then he says, I went, after that period, after conferring with them 3 years into my ministry, I then went into the regions of Syria and Cilicia, and I was still unknown by sight to the churches of Judea that are in Christ. So the local original leaders and their communities that they've planted all around Judea, they don't even know who Paul is at this point, but he is still off now going planting new churches in Syria and Cilicia. All they knew is they'd heard it said, the one who was formerly persecuting us is now proclaiming the faith he once tried to destroy. And so they glorified God because of me. So they were happy to hear that this former persecutor had actually turned tail, or become a turncoat against persecution and had become an actual Christian. That was making them happy, that part of it. So there's kind of a map here where we're kind of showing the fringes of the Roman Empire. Some of these provinces like Cilicia and Syria are directly governed by Roman officials. Judea is kind of going back and forth, where it is sometimes governed in part by Roman procurators, but it's also occasionally given over as a client kingdom. It had been the client kingdom of Herod, and some of the components are given to members of Herod's dynasty to rule over little parts of it. And then there's the subsidiary kingdoms like Nabatea, the Arabia, that is outside, and that's where Paul starts his first 3 years of planting Christian communities. So Paul, after the first 3 years, when he has this meeting finally with Peter and James, he's still kind of operating a bit under their radar, as he says. But one thing that does happen is that he shifts his focus from that Nabatea area, where Petra and so on exists, to Roman Syria and Cilicia, where he begins planting communities, again, based on this understanding that non-Jewish converts to the movement do not need to convert first to Judaism before they can become Christian, as now we're going to have that word. So according to the book of Acts, now as Paul's community gets planted and going in Antioch, that's where the word Christian is coined for followers of Christ. So Paul continues in his letter to the Galatians. Then after 14 years, I went up again to Jerusalem with Barnabas, taking Titus along with me. I went up in response to a revelation. Then I laid before them, though only in a private meeting with the acknowledged leaders, the gospel that I proclaim among the Gentiles in order to make sure that I was not running or had not run in vain. So this second Jerusalem meeting, private meeting that Paul describes, so it's probably 14 years after his conversion, so 11 years after the first meeting. So when he's saying 14 years, after 14 years, that's presumably after his conversion, although you can possibly make the argument as the other way. You can. This meeting took place, while he has established the successful ministry in Syria and Cilicia that he talked about it before. So Paul and his companions, Barnabas and Titus, meet privately in Jerusalem with people that Paul himself describes as the acknowledged leaders of the church. He apologetically insists that he only went there in response to revelation. So he's perhaps implying that if he had been summoned by the acknowledged leaders to explain himself and explain what kind of gospel he's teaching because they've heard bad things, he's more or less saying, well, I didn't go because they summoned me. They don't have any authority to summon me. I went in response to revelation. The meeting is about, again, Paul's view that non-Jewish converts need not adhere to Jewish law, and the implication is the acknowledged leaders were not in agreement with him because he's really worried here that his entire ministry might have been in vain. Even Titus, he continues on this. Even Titus, who was with me, was not compelled to be circumcised, though he was Greek. But it was because of false brothers and sisters secretly brought in. So I'm going to say, actually, I'm missing one slide in one section, so I will just explain what the passage here is, in between where it explains specifically that the leaders that he is in this argument with are Peter, John, and James, the brother of Jesus. And so those are the acknowledged pillars that he is confronting. And he tries to hold out against them, but anyway, they're on opposite sides. And so then he's confronted by the leadership in the course of that. So we'll get to this part of the passage. So even Titus, who was with me, who does not have any Jewish background, but he's a Christian, was not compelled to be circumcised, though he was a Greek. But because of false brothers and sisters secretly brought in, who had slipped in to spy on the freedom that we have in Jesus Christ so that they might enslave us, we did not submit to them even for a moment, so that the truth of the gospel may always remain with you. So what he's essentially admitting here is there are people in Paul's communities in Galatia, in Anatolia, who have come down to Jerusalem and are siding with the Jerusalem leaders against Paul. And so Paul calls them spies, so people who are telling on him for how he's operating. Paul's really only his weak defense here is that, there's spies from the Antioch, not from Galatia. He's writing to the Galatians, but he's talking about his church in Antioch, in Syria. His only weak defense from those who were supposed to be acknowledged leaders. They're supposed to be acknowledged leaders. What they actually were makes no difference to me, whether they're acknowledged leaders or not. God shows no partiality. Those leaders contributed nothing to me. So in standing up for his rival interpretation of the gospel, Paul now undercuts claims of the acknowledged leaders in any event that contributed nothing to Paul. So who are these acknowledged leaders in Jerusalem that Paul is failing to acknowledge? So this is that section that I thought was misplaced. So here's where that slide that is. Anyway, who are they? They're James, Peter, and John. So on the contrary, when they saw that I had been entrusted with the gospel for the uncircumcised, so I have this special calling to speak to non-Jewish potential converts, so Greek-speaking pagan converts, just as Peter had been entrusted with the gospel for the circumcised, in other words, to go to Jewish people to try to convert them. For he who worked through Peter, making him an apostle to the circumcised, also worked through me in sending me to the Gentiles. And when James and Cephas and John, who were the acknowledged pillars, recognized that grace had been given me, they gave to Barnabas and me the right hand of fellowship, agreeing that we should go to the Gentiles and they to the circumcised. They asked only one thing, that we remember the poor, which was actually what I was eager to do. So this is Paul's version of this compromise then. Paul characterizes the outcome of the meeting as recognizing two separate spheres. So Peter should go ahead and keep taking the gospel as he understands it to non-Christian Jews, while Paul can continue to preach his understanding of the gospel to non-Jews, to these Greek-speaking pagans, the Gentiles. In response, as Paul plants these communities, these new communities of wealthier non-Jewish Christians, those communities would take up an offering in support of the poor, which may be a reference here then to this mendicant church, the spiritual community in Jerusalem, the poor of Jerusalem. So, whether or not, that's Paul's version of the compromise, whether or not James, Peter, and John understood things this way, the supposed compromise quickly broke down, even in Paul's explanation, when Peter came to Antioch. So he says, when Cephas came to Antioch, I opposed him to his face because he stood self-condemned. For until certain people came from James, he used to eat with the Gentiles. But after they came, he drew back and kept himself separate for fear of the circumcision faction. And the other Jews joined him in this hypocrisy, so that even Barnabas was led away by their hypocrisy. But when I saw that they were not acting consistently with the truth of the gospel, I said to Cephas before them all, if you, though a Jew, live like a Gentile and not like a Jew, how can you compel the Gentiles to live like Jews? So, in Paul's telling, he successfully calls out Peter's hypocrisy. In other words, the idea that Peter had previously shared meals with Christians who were not adhering to Jewish law. Nevertheless, even here, Paul admits in his own companion, Barnabas, ends up siding with Peter's circumcision faction. So the conflict is continuing. The faction that is being led by James, including people that are being sent directly by James, as Paul admits, have now claimed control essentially of Peter and Barnabas and are starting to influence everybody in this church in Antioch. Even though Paul is kind of claiming victory in this fight, the victory actually led him to cede all the churches that he had planted in Antioch, in Syria, and Cilicia. He gives them now to Peter and the circumcision faction, that is the Jerusalem church. And so Paul retreats, and he now starts this third phase of his ministry, planting churches in Anatolia, in Macedonia, and in Greece. And he's writing now to the Galatians, who are part of that Anatolian community, or community in Anatolia that he's planted. And he's writing them because now more representatives again from the Jerusalem church are coming to attack his interpretation and his authority. So what does Paul tell us about James? In sum, Paul tells us that James is the brother of Jesus and is based in Jerusalem with a group probably here that we're thinking of as the poor of Jerusalem. That James is the acknowledged leader, a pillar of the church, along with Jesus' disciples, Peter and John, and that James is allied with Peter against Paul as part of what Paul calls a circumcision faction of the church. In other words, that James believes Christians have to adhere to Jewish law, including for men being circumcised, but it also includes dietary restrictions and so on, what meals you can eat with people. It doesn't necessarily mean all of what we now think of as rabbinic interpretations of law, all the hundreds of commandments that are kept in rabbinic Judaism. This is still in a lot of flux in the first century, deciding what components of the law different factions or different sects within Judaism were maintaining. Okay, so that was Paul's account of James. Josephus also gives us an account of James, which again confirms, I think, the historicity of James, and it comes from, like I say, a Roman Jewish historian. Writing under the patronage of the Flavian dynasty, so the emperors Vespasian and then Titus, after the First Roman Jewish War, which Josephus took part in and actually changed sides in, and thus has a lot of biases that we have to read. Josephus gives an account of James' execution by the high priest Ananus, most likely in the year 62, the way it's described. So in his book Antiquities of the Jews, Josephus narrates actually a pretty, not that long, but anyway, a story about the execution of a guy he calls James, the brother of Jesus, who is called Christ, as an illustration really of the unstable political situation in Judea. It's not something that he's really concerned so much with this guy, James, but he was more concerned with this, frankly, with Ananus. So we read in Josephus, and now Caesar, by which he means the Caesar that we call Nero, upon hearing the death of Festus, and this is a person who had been the procurator in Judea from about the year 60 to about 62 of the Common Era AD, Caesar sent Albinus into Judea as procurator. So again, that begins at that same time. But the king, this is Herod Agrippa, who is a local, he's part of the Herodian dynasty. He is a tetrarch over parts of the former, what Herod Agrippa had ruled the whole client kingdom. Now Herod Agrippa II only has small parts of the territory that he's ruling as a tetrarch. The king deprived Joseph of the high priesthood and bestowed the succession to that dignity on the son of Ananus, who was himself also called Ananus. So Ananus ben Ananus. Now, the report goes that the eldest Ananus proved a most fortunate man, for he had 5 sons, who all had performed the office of a high priest to God, and who had himself enjoyed that dignity for a long time formerly, which had never happened to any other of our high priests. So this is a wonderful blessing if you can be high priest, and then you actually have 5 sons who all serve in that office. But this younger Ananus, his son, who, as we've told you already, took the high priesthood, was a bold man in his temper and very insolent. He was also of the sect of the Sadducees, who are very rigid in judging offenders, above all the rest of the Jews, as we have already observed. When, therefore, Ananus was of this disposition, he now thought he had a proper opportunity. Festus, the Roman procurator, was now dead, and Albinus, the new procurator, was but on the road. So Ananus assembled the Sanhedrin of judges, the local council, Jewish council, and brought before them the brother of Jesus, who was called Christ, whose name was James, and some others. And when he'd formed an accusation against them as breakers of the law, he delivered them to be stoned. But as for those who seemed the most equitable of the citizens, and as such were the most uneasy at the breach of the laws, they disliked what was done. They also sent to the king, to the Herod Agrippa II, the tetrarch, desiring him to send to Ananus that he should act so no more, for that was what he had already, for that what he already had done was not to be justified. Nay, some of them also went to meet Albinus as he was on his journey from Alexandria, and informed him that it was not lawful for Ananus to assemble a Sanhedrin without his consent. Whereupon Albinus complied with what they said, and wrote in anger to Ananus, and threatened that he would bring to him punishment for what he had done, on which King Herod Agrippa II took the high priesthood from him when he had ruled but 3 months, and he made Jesus, the son of Damnaeus, a completely different Jesus than the historical Jesus, obviously, the Jewish high priest, made him now high priest. So, what does all that tell us? James is not an important person to Josephus per se, but this incident illustrates the political opportunism of Ananus, and generally speaking, Josephus doesn't like Sadducees anyway. Josephus does not claim that he credits, so he doesn't think that James's brother Jesus actually was the Christ, but rather he just identifies him as the brother of that Jesus who was called Christ. There's so many Jameses, you have to identify this James somehow. And presumably, the people who called James's brother Jesus Christ were James himself and the group that he's leading in Jerusalem. So it's kind of a throwaway identifier for Josephus. Ananus, meanwhile, apparently saw James as someone that he'd preferred to be rid of. So the leader maybe, again, we can just say if he's the leader of this alternate sect that has a bunch of poor begging mendicants that are around Jerusalem, he wants to clean that up and get rid of beggars and that kind of a thing. Spiritual leader that some people who are not even Christians are relatively upset when they decide to execute him. But nevertheless, because there is this brief respite from Roman administration, so one of the procurators has died, the other one hasn't been able to get there, he uses that opportunity to execute James and a bunch of other people on a pretext. And so, again, an action that isn't universally popular and ultimately costs him his job. So if we just want to kind of look at a timeline here of essentially the Roman Empire, so the emperors on the left column, so going back from essentially the reign of Augustus, the first emperor, Emperor Octavian, to his death, then his successors, Tiberius, Caligula, Claudius, and Nero. So we're here in the reign of Nero. And you can kind of see then, as rulers over Judea, there are initially a set of prefects, including Pontius Pilate, who is prefect from 26 to 36. In other words, therefore, when the historical Jesus is crucified, then there is a period of time when the client kingdom is resurrected by Claudius, and given to his childhood friend, Herod Agrippa I, who becomes king of the area. Then after Herod Agrippa's death, Roman rule over Judea itself anyway is returned, and now it's organized under a higher official, a procurator. And so then we can kind of see when Felix here dies, then Festus is sent out to replace him. So that's the time period when James is executed. And it's just a couple decades here before the Jewish revolt that is going to lead to, where the leaders of the Roman forces, Vespasian and Titus, end up being the next imperial dynasty after the extinction of the original Julio-Claudian dynasty with Nero's death. So if we turn our timeline sideways and we look at it, kind of the middle of the first century here, from 25 to 75, so the reigns of Claudius through Nero and Vespasian, and we have again those prefects, Herod Agrippa, the procurators, and then the revolt. We also then are kind of having in our timeline the beheading of John the Baptist, the crucifixion of Jesus, the assumption of James as leadership over the Jerusalem church over a much longer period of time until he is stoned by the high priest, Ananus. Meanwhile, we can see in the middle here, Saul's conversion. He becomes Paul. His Roman name is Paul. That he meets James and Peter a couple years after that. He then begins planting churches in Antioch, and then he has this Jerusalem, it's sometimes called the Jerusalem Council, but what Paul calls a private meeting, again with Peter, James, and John, where he gives up Antioch to Peter. And so then Paul moves on to plant churches in Anatolia, Macedonia, and Greece, and that's when he starts also writing letters to keep them on side with him as he continues to experience messengers and apostles who are coming to those communities as rivals. And so because Paul now starts formulating his ideas or writing them down rhetorically, that's going to have a lot of lasting influence ultimately. Paul is executed around the year 60, James around 62, and then as the Jewish revolt happens, the Jerusalem church flees to Pella, and causing the end essentially of the Jacobite church in Jerusalem itself, although Jewish law observing Christians continue to exist for centuries after this. So that's sort of our timeline. So what are our other sources on James the Just? So the remaining sources are all written by early Christians, and they come with complications. So they are written by members of different communities who are attempting to assert the authority of their tradition. And one of the ways that all these rival communities are doing that after the death of these early leaders is by claiming the authority of one leader or another. And when they claim the authority, let's say, of Peter, if another rival community that has a very different interpretation is claiming the authority, say, of Thomas, then in their telling of the gospel story, they want to elevate Peter and potentially denigrate Thomas, as we'll see. So, for example, the Markan community that of which the Gospel of Mark emerges, even though in some ways, because of the the author of Mark's literary conceit, the author of Mark wants everybody to kind of who's reading the text to to profess who they think Jesus is, that Jesus is the Messiah, and so therefore all of the disciples kind of come off as being more foolish and confused than they otherwise might. Nevertheless, Peter is a clear leader in the first narrative gospel here from Mark, and so there's also a important leader, James, but it's not James the brother of Jesus, it's James the son of Zebedee, and John. So these are in special Markan narratives, Peter, James, and John, who are seen as leaders of the disciples. In the Johannine community, out of which the Gospel of John and other texts like the Epistles of John emerge, they also recognize Peter as a leader of the disciples, but they really elevate within their own community in the Gospel of John a unnamed beloved disciple, which later tradition calls John the Beloved, but is an anonymous or unnamed in the Gospel itself. And so, for example, when they hear that Jesus' tomb is empty, Peter and the beloved disciple race to the tomb, and the beloved disciple beats Peter there, although he then lets Peter enter the tomb first. And so, in other words, these are both very, they're elevating their stature as leaders, this beloved disciple within the Johannine community. The Thomasite community, by contrast, is represented by the Gospel of Thomas, and then later also, I think, in kind of proto-Gnostic and Gnostic texts, tends to elevate instead Thomas, especially, Mary Magdalene as essentially a full disciple, an apostle. And there is a pretty interesting passage in Thomas itself, anyway, about James the Just as opposed to James the son of Zebedee or son of Alphaeus, any one of these other Jameses. So by contrast to the ones that they're elevating, obviously the main narratives that make it into the Bibles are very negative about Judas. And generally speaking, Judas is seen as the traitor disciple, although there are texts and minority community within early Christianity that saw it the other way. And then specifically in the Markan narrative, James, the brother of Jesus, James the Just, is actually very denigrated, as we'll see. In the Johannine community, Thomas, the apostle, doubts that Jesus has been resurrected until he can see it for himself. And so if he's more or less saying that all of these people that look to Thomas for their authority, who are they? They have this, their apostolic leader, didn't have the kind of faith that the rest of the apostles had. Meanwhile, in the Thomasite community, Peter actually comes off as a leader that doesn't get it. And same thing with, in some of the stories, some of the sayings, Matthew and some of the other prominent leaders are not understanding Jesus' true teachings. So let's look at some of that in Thomas. So in contrast to the very familiar passage in Mark chapter 8, where Jesus asks the disciples, who do you say that I am? And Peter more or less announces, you're the Messiah, he declares. And so that is Peter's testimony. The saying number 13 in the Gospel of Thomas puts very different answers into the mouths of the disciples when Jesus asks a similar question. So we read in the Gospel of Thomas, Jesus said to his disciples, compare me to someone and tell me whom I am like. Simon Peter said to him, you are like a righteous angel. Matthew said to him, you are like a wise philosopher. Thomas said to him, Master, my mouth is wholly incapable of saying whom you are like. Jesus said, I'm not your master. Because you have drunk, you have become intoxicated from the bubbling spring which I have measured out. And he took Thomas, and he withdrew, and he told him 3 things. And when Thomas returned to his companions, they asked him, "What did Jesus say to you?" Thomas said to them, "If I tell you one of the things which he told me, you will pick up stones and throw them at me. A fire will come out of the stones and burn you up." So, in other words, in Thomas, Peter and Matthew misunderstand entirely who Jesus is. Thomas, though, has a higher perception, and then that higher perception is rewarded by Jesus with secret teachings, what the true gospel actually is. Similarly, in the Gospel of Thomas, Mary, almost certainly Mary Magdalene, is participating in the dialogue as a disciple alongside the male disciples in both saying 21 and saying 144. And in that last one, when Peter objects, Jesus immediately disagrees with Peter. So Simon Peter said to Jesus, "Let Mary leave us, for women are not worthy of life." And by this, he think it means eternal life or spiritual life. Jesus said, "I myself shall lead her in order to make her male, so that she too may become a living spirit resembling you males. For every woman who will make herself male will enter the kingdom of heaven." So while Jesus' teaching here requires a bunch of annotation, in other words, we need to understand that the perspective in this gospel, physical mortality, humans are divided by things like gender. But when they understand their true spiritual self, they'll transcend that dividedness. You know, male and female created, he, them, God created them. Then they will achieve a kind of a spiritual oneness in the kingdom of heaven, the true spiritual kingdom. So with that kind of annotation for this relatively obscure saying, Peter's objection to having a female disciple and having a female disciple be considered on par with the male disciples may indicate that the Thomasite community, they're opposing a male-only hierarchy that may be emerging in rival Christian communities that look to Peter for their authority. So as we know, over time, the proto-Orthodox church that develops, there develops a priesthood structure which is a male-only priesthood. You can't, women are not able to be bishops and priests. They can be deaconesses, they could be apostles and prophets, but apostles and prophets cease to be important, and they're eventually not allowed to be deaconesses anymore in the church that emerges. So even more to the point within the Gospel of Thomas, for our focus today on James, is a saying preserved in saying number 12. The disciples say to Jesus, "We know that you will depart from us. Who is to be our leader?" Jesus said to them, "Wherever you are to go to James the just, for whose sake heaven and earth came to be into being." So in addition to explicitly naming James the just as Jesus' successor or the leader after he leaves, in other words, as opposed to Peter, giving Peter the keys of the kingdom as occurs in the Matthean community in the Gospel of Matthew, this saying also assigns James an extraordinarily heightened theological role. Heaven and earth came into being for the sake of James, which is a strange for like later understandings of how Jesus and the divine work and James's role, whatever it would be, it's a much more exalted role, right? So in contrast with this exalted role that's given to him in Thomas, James is not even mentioned by name in the Gospel of John, where Jesus' brothers are simply listed as opponents of Jesus' ministry. So we read in John chapter 7, "Now the Jewish festival of booths was near. So Jesus' brothers said to him, 'Leave here and go to Judea so that your disciples may also see the works you are doing. For no one wants to be widely known acts in secret. If you do these things, show yourself to the world.'" And then it says editorially, "For not even his brothers believed in him." So the brothers don't believe that these signs that Jesus is performing. The Gospel of Mark is similarly hostile to Jesus' family, or shows them as being antagonistic to Jesus' ministry. So we read in Mark chapter 3, when his family heard that Jesus was casting out demons, they went out to restrain him, for people were saying, "He's gone out of his mind." Then Jesus' mother and his brothers came, and standing outside, they sent to him and called him. A crowd was sitting around him, and they said to him, "Your mother and your brothers are outside asking for you." And he replied, "Who are my mother and my brothers?" And looking at those who sat around him, he said, "Here are my mother and my brothers. Whoever does the will of God is my brother and sister and mother." So rather than believing in Jesus' calling in Mark, his mother and brothers hear this report anyway that he's gone insane, and they are trying to restrain him. And this causes Jesus to reject his biological family and to assert that his sisters and brothers and mother are the disciples who have committed to be part of his movement. So unlike in John, where the brothers are unnamed, Mark later lists James as among Jesus' brothers. So people in Jesus' hometown asked of Jesus, "Is this not the carpenter, the son of Mary, and the brother of James and Joseph and Jude and Simon? And are not his sisters here with us?" So there's a list of 4 named brothers, and there's also sisters, and also Jesus' mother is named here, Mary, as opposed to in the Gospel of John, where she's not named. Elevating a different James. So in addition to listing James, Jesus' brother, as an opponent, Mark creates his own special trio among the apostles, which consist of a Peter, James, and John. However, the James here in Mark is not James, Jesus' brother. It's a different James, James the son of Zebedee. So in Mark's narrative, these 3 apostles alone are invited to witness the transfiguration. So in other words, they're set apart as a special leadership group within the 12 in Mark's gospel. And while we can't know, it may be that Mark is deliberately removing James, the brother of Jesus, James the Just, from this threesome that Paul has talked about as the acknowledged pillars, Peter, James, and John. So now instead of he's saying, no, James, Jesus' brother, is an opponent of Jesus, and whenever you hear about Peter, James, and John, that's a different James that they're talking about. They're not talking about his brother. So we can't say for sure, but that might be what Mark is doing. The author of Luke Acts, same author wrote the Gospel of Luke and also wrote the book Acts of the Apostles, is using Mark as a source, but as we've seen elsewhere, probably did not have direct access to Paul's letters. The author is probably from a Greek-speaking Gentile Christian community that maybe have originally been planted by Paul, but later was led by representatives of Peter and James, and so has a synthesized view of this early period. So in Luke's retelling or rewriting of Mark's gospel, all of the kind of negative references to Jesus' family are deleted. Luke is very able and willing to, the Gospel of Matthew preserves more all the things that Mark writes. When Luke disagrees, Luke will delete stuff from Mark. And instead of having Mary be, an opponent, she's given, really in Luke, an exalted prophetic role when, for example, at the beginning of the gospel in Luke, an angel Gabriel appears to Mary and says, "Blessed are you among all women, Hail Mary." This sort of component that is totally absent from the Markan gospel. Jesus' brother James is absent in the early part of Acts of the Apostles. So it's not listed as one of the 12 because Again, Luke is inheriting a list of the 12 from Mark. But nevertheless, James, the brother of Jesus, does appear in the Acts version of this story of the Council of Jerusalem, this meeting that Paul and Barnabas and Titus have with Peter, James, and John at Jerusalem. So, as described in the book of Acts, chapter 15, there's a second account of this encounter that Paul described that I read before. But it's actually very, very different in the telling in Acts. So in Acts 15 we read, "Then certain individuals came down from Judea and were teaching the brothers, 'Unless you are circumcised according to the custom of Moses, you cannot be saved.' And after Paul and Barnabas had no small dissension and debate with them, Paul and Barnabas and some of the others were appointed to go up to Jerusalem to discuss this question with the apostles and the elders." So in Acts, in the next component of this, as the story goes on, the circumcision party is identified with some believers, so some Christians who belonged to the sect of Pharisees. So there is kind of an unnamed scapegoats who were still had been converted Pharisees, who are the circumcision party effectively in Acts, and it's not, therefore, Peter, James, and John who are on the other side of this debate. In fact, in Acts' telling of the story, Peter actually stands up and testifies in a long speech to the Pauline position, and he concludes at the end, "We believe that we will be saved through the grace of the Lord Jesus." So he states here Paul's position as opposed to the way Paul described the private meeting that he'd had with Peter. So the Acts 15 concludes, "The whole assembly kept silence and listened to Barnabas and Paul as they told all the signs and wonders that God had done through them and among the Gentiles. And after they finished speaking, James replied," and we know this is not the Zebedee because he's already been martyred by this time. So this is another James. So we're going to assume James, the brother of Jesus. "He replied, 'My brothers, listen to me. Simeon,'" by which he means Peter, "has related how God first looked favorably on the Gentiles to take from among them a people for his name." And James then goes on to quote 3 or 4 different prophets from the Hebrew Bible to support this idea before concluding, "Therefore I have reached the decision that we should not trouble these Gentiles who are turning toward God, but we should write to them to abstain only from things polluted by idols, and from sexual immorality, and from whatever has been strangled, and from blood. For in every city for generations past, Moses has had those who proclaim him, for he has been read aloud every Sabbath in the synagogues." So, in other words, in the Acts version, the description of the meeting, who's on each side and what the outcome is differs substantially from the way Paul tells the story in Galatians. So what we could probably say here is without access to Paul's letters, the author of Acts seems to be preserving a tradition within the Lucan community that some important meeting had taken place in Jerusalem, while deliberately really obscuring any hint that Paul had actually been in opposition to Peter and James, now that all 3 of them are all long dead by the time Acts is being written. So now the compromise, instead of that they're going to go into separate directions and who they're converting, and that Paul's going to take up a collection, the compromise is instead, refrain from sexual immorality, don't eat food that has been offered as a sacrifice to idols. That again is even contradicted by what Paul's other writings are for when he's advising people about that. He's saying that he has a much more pragmatic response to that kind of a thing. So the only other mention of James in the book of Acts comes near the end when Paul makes his final visit to Jerusalem prior to his arrest. it reads there, when Paul and his companions arrived in Jerusalem, the brothers welcomed us warmly. The next day, Paul went with us to visit James, and all of the elders were present. As Paul explained in his letter to the Romans, his own writings, he was once again conceding all of the churches that he'd planted. So this time he's conceding everything in Anatolia, Macedonia, and Greece. And he plans to personally deliver an offering he's taken up from his churches to James and the poor of Jerusalem before starting over again in Spain via way of Rome, where he's hoping the Romans are going to give him a contribution to support his ministry in Spain. In the book of Acts account, James and his companions suggest that Paul undergo a Jewish purification ritual in order to be able to enter the temple precinct, which is reserved for observant Jews. But once he's inside, he's denounced and arrested. Ultimately, he's imprisoned, and he ultimately appeals his case to Rome, where he's eventually executed. The book of Acts, once again, papers over any division here. So the people who denounce him in the text are certain Jews from Asia, so Anatolia probably. But the denunciation might just as easily have come from a member of James' church, somebody who is in opposition to Paul, who wants to have an easy way to get rid of this guy who's been a problem for them. So we can't know, that's again speculative, but the Acts story is coming from its own perspective. Once the division has been gone, Paul's perspective has won out, even if he had initially lost control of the churches that and the communities from which the author of Acts is coming from. Whatever the cause of however he got arrested, whoever denounced him, Paul was executed by around 60, and James was executed in 62. And as we'll see, the remnants of James' church was forced to flee Jerusalem by 70 when the city was itself destroyed. So let's look now, after James, to the Jacobite church, and as it existed after James, and it maybe remembered James. So in keeping with the information about Jerusalem leadership that we've already had in Paul and Josephus and Acts, the early Christian historian Eusebius states the tradition that this James, whom the people of old called the just, because of his outstanding virtue, was the first, as the record tells us, to be elected to the episcopal throne of the Jerusalem church. He cites as his source a late 2nd, early 3rd century Christian leader, Clement of Alexandria. And so the tradition has that in addition to being an apostle, James is also the first bishop of Jerusalem. Certainly we saw historically he's the leader of the church or the community of Jerusalem, whether or not the bishoprics are still evolving, during the time he's leading. So the leadership of his community may now have passed to another brother, to Jude, who identified as Jude, the brother of James. According to Eusebius and another early Christian writer, Epiphanius, the Christians of Jerusalem fled to Pella, which is one of the cities in the Decapolis in the Transjordan. It's now Jordan. You can kind of see in the middle of this map, Pella. A number of later 1st century or early 2nd century texts that are attributed to James, Jude, and also Peter seem to invoke the perspective of this community as they invoke the names of leaders of the Jacobite church. So, for example, the Epistle of James claims to be written by somebody named James, and it's a common name, so it isn't really specifying which James it is. So it begins in its superscription, James, a servant of God and of the Lord Jesus Christ, to the 12 tribes in dispersion. Though early on in Christian tradition associates this James, the author, or the claimed author, purported author of the Epistle of James, with James the Just. And so Origen, for example, believed that James the Just was the author here, but not all early Christians agreed. So, for example, Eusebius again notes James, who is said to be the author of the first of the so-called Catholic epistles, but it is to be observed that it is disputed. So Eusebius is reporting that even in his time among early Christians, it's not clear that everybody agrees, or everybody does not agree that this is written by James the Just. The predominant scholarly view now is that the text is pseudonymous. It's been written in James's name by someone in the later first century or the very early beginning of the second century, and it's written for a community that wants to invoke James the Just, as their kind of apostolic authority. So written with that community, the Jacobite Church's values in mind. The epistle confronts many Pauline themes directly. So, for example, to the idea that Paul presents that Christ sets us free from the curse of the law, as we read in Galatians. It's kind of bold letter against observance of Jewish law. The Epistle of James, the author of the Epistle of James, asserts that it's actually law is what gives us freedom. It's not we are being freed from law. The law is what makes us free. So we read in chapter 1, those who look into the perfect law, the law of liberty, and persevere, being not hearers who forget, but doers who act, they will be blessed in their doing. So the perfect law is a law of liberty. Where Paul argued that a person is justified by faith and not by works, that is, you don't have to adhere to Jewish law by, for men getting circumcised and having certain dietary restrictions of following, keeping the Sabbath holy and so on. The Epistle of James counters a person is justified by works and not by faith alone. For just as the body without the spirit is dead, so faith without works is also dead. So you have to adhere to Jewish law as far as the author of James is concerned. Paul may have been using the phrase the poor, as we've seen, to refer to the Jerusalem community who lived as mendicants. The theme of poor and rich is a strong theme in the Epistle of James. And the community may well have been living by the motto, blessed are the poor, for theirs is the kingdom of God. But the Epistle of James also vocally condemns the rich. Read in chapter 5, come now, you rich people, weep and wail for the miseries that are coming to you. Your gold and silver have rusted, and their rust will be evidence against you, and it will eat your flesh like fire. Listen, the wages of the laborers who mowed your fields, which kept you back by fraud, cry out, and the cries of the harvesters have reached the ears of the Lord of hosts. You have lived on the earth in luxury and in pleasure. You have nourished your hearts in a day of slaughter. You have condemned and murdered the righteous one who does not resist you. So, interestingly, although the Epistle of James recognizes Jesus as the Lord Jesus Christ, the author doesn't spend a lot of time extensively quoting Jesus, the same way that Paul doesn't quote Jesus, but there are Jesus-style teachings or teachings that are attributed to Jesus elsewhere in the Gospels. So, for example, in Matthew 7:7, there's Jesus says, ask and it will be given to you. That kind of teaching are simply spoken by the author of James as though James the Just is writing it. So, for example, in James 1:5, if any of you is lacking in wisdom, ask God who gives to all generously and ungrudgingly, and it will be given you. So, ask God and it will be given you. So this may show that in the Jacobite church, James was also a teacher and a prophet that was held in extremely high esteem. So we remember that saying in Thomas that not only is James a successor, but for his sake, heaven and earth came into being. So a more exalted role for James. So he's almost like John the Baptist. Jesus and James are maybe on closer footing. This may also explain why the author of the Epistle of Jude, which also reflects this Jacobite church focus, calls himself the brother of James, rather than specifying that he too is the brother of the Lord. So at the beginning of this little tiny book, Jude, the letter says, Jude, a servant of Jesus Christ and brother of James, to those who are called, who are beloved in God the Father and kept safe for Jesus Christ, may mercy, peace, and love be yours in abundance. So, as with the Epistle of James, the brief letter of Jude is thought to be a late first century or very early second century text, written pseudonymously, but with the idea of invoking one of these past leaders of the Jacobite Christian community, in this case, Jude, the brother of James, the brother of Jesus. Jude's purpose, when we get to the meat of this text, is actually to attack false teachers. And so Jude says these teachers are grumblers and malcontents. They indulge their lusts. Their mouths utter bombastic nonsense, flattering people to their own advantage. So while not explicitly condemning Christian communities that reject adherence to Jewish law, the author does here say that the teachers, these false teachers that he's writing to warn the true Christians against, they have been indulging in their lusts. And so for Paul, who's arguing that we are set free from the law, the Jacobite response to that is, without obedience to the law, which includes things like thou shalt not commit adultery, you're inviting wanton libertinism. So that is a counter argument, and that's maybe the argument that's being made here. There may be also throughout Jude some veiled attacks on Paul. So Randall McCraw-Helms, in a really book I recommend here called The Bible Against Itself, argues that the author of Jude is making veiled references to Paul in various diatribes that this little one-chapter book has. And so, for example, the author of Jude references the Old Testament figure Korah's rebellion against Moses during the wandering in the wilderness period. So Moses, of course, is shorthand for the law, since the 5 books of Moses, the Torah, the law, are attributed to Moses, while Korah in Hebrew means bald. And so bald is one of the characteristics that is traditionally shared by Paul. So Paul is often portrayed and thought of, in tradition anyway, as being bald. And so is it possible that the rebel against the law, the rebel against Moses, Korah, here is Paul, the baldy? Likewise, the author of Jude, after condemning sexual immorality, and in my opinion, very much misinterpreting the Sodom and Gomorrah story and talking about unnatural lust, the author of Jude says that his enemies, this rival church leaders, in the same way, says of his enemies, in the same way, these dreamers also defile the flesh and they reject the authority of Scripture. So again, this may be slander or veiled slander against Paul and his many male apostolic companions. And so we had a whole lecture on whether Paul, what Paul's sexual orientation might have been, and maybe this is an example of Paul's enemies saying that that there is there's a rumor that he anyway is engaging in sexual or what they're considering to be sexual immorality. I wouldn't say that there's any truth to the charge that there's anything actually happening, but it is the kind of way to, again, make a veiled attack on Paul. Another of these Jacobite books that made its way into the New Testament, the second Epistle of Peter, which is not written by Peter, but is certainly a pseudonymous expansion of Jude, takes some of those charges that are in Jude and expands on them. And so in this case, it directly equates this bombastic nonsense that these bad teachers are having, in other words, Greek rhetoric, it equates that with the freedom from law that results in debased desires of the flesh. So we read in 2 Peter chapter 2, "For they speak bombastic nonsense." These people who have learned Greek rhetoric, like Paul, I presume. "And with debased desires of the flesh, they entice people who have just escaped from those who live in error." So people who've just stopped being pagans and now they're using debased desires of the flesh to entice them. "They promise them freedom, but they themselves are slaves of corruption, for people are slaves to whatever masters them." So this is the charge against Christians who potentially can be read as a charge against Christians who don't think you have to obey Jewish law. So whether or not the texts of James, Jude, 1 Peter, 2 Peter, whether they're making attacks on Paul and his successors, which it's not direct, they're only oblique. The references are oblique enough for later Proto-Orthodox Christians to be able to argue that now the texts actually have other opponents in mind. These are not actually referring to Paul and his companions, but there's some other heretics or something like that. So meanwhile, as Paul's texts became seen as authoritative, as Paul's letters do become scriptural for the Proto-Orthodox community as it emerges, adherence to Jewish law falls out of the mainstream. So Paul's argument, even if he seemed to have lost in life time to James, afterwards his views went out, having left them written in very strong arguments. So if the Jacobite church continued, if the portions of it that continued to adhere to Jewish law continued as, for example, groups that are later known as the Ebionites and the Nazarenes, then many of their other scriptures, besides those epistles that made their way into the New Testament, were actually excluded from the canon and were subsequently lost. And so we saw that in our Lost Gospels of the Hebrews lecture. So that includes the Gospel of the Hebrews, the Gospel of the Ebionites, the Gospel of the Nazarenes. So by the time we get to Nicaea, by the time of the Emperor Constantine's conversion and patronage of a unified Catholic Orthodox imperial church, adherence to Jewish law was officially viewed as a heresy by that emerging imperial church. And so labeled as such, Jewish adherent Christianity died out in the Roman Empire by the 5th and 6th centuries. And as we've seen, some Jewish sects survived by making their way beyond the imperial frontiers to the Hejaz in Arabia. And it's probably that version that influenced the Prophet Muhammad through his relatives who were Christian. And so as a result, although the Ebionites died out, their Christology became embedded in Islam, which views Christ as a prophet and not as God. And we're going to do a whole lecture on how Jesus is understood in Islam and even how sayings of Jesus in Muslim tradition, because it's a very interesting legacy there. And so with that picture, This is kind of my answer to what can we know and what can we say about James, the brother of Jesus, and the Jacobite Church, including the successors to the question of should Christians adhere to Jewish law. And while Leandro gets your questions, I'm going to get a drink of water. Okay, so thanks for your support. I want to thank David Foltz and Mark Long, and Dan Howard and Daryl Scott and Mike R. and Unrecognized Talent and Brad Stewart. Thank you all so much. Your support really allows us to devote as much time as we do to these lectures that we really love researching and preparing all of the slides for. Julie Bazuski says, do you think that a Jamesian church might exist today had it not been for the First Roman-Jewish War, that two distinct branches of Christianity would have developed? Julie, I don't think so, because I don't think that, I appreciate that is one of the problems that that caused it to decline in power really rapidly. But I think that there were other issues as well. I think that the lack of, early serious writing arguments contradicting Paul, and the fact that even though, again, that church and that community took control of, or representatives from that church took control of, or were greeted by, or were in communion with all of these churches that Paul planted, nevertheless, because all of these churches that Paul planted were filled with Gentiles, eventually they all kind of reverted to what Paul's teachings were. And so I think that for a group to have survived, it really would have needed to escape outside of the imperial frontiers in a lot of strength. And so if one of these guys had, a missionary who was really focused on anti-Paul stuff, if that person had, for example, converted the Ethiopians and that had allowed that to have a completely separate Ethiopian church, then suddenly then it could have existed in Ethiopia. But it's not just a matter of continuing to exist in Jerusalem, where it would always have been under threat by a lot of rival forces, both Jewish and Roman, pagan, Christian, Roman later, and ultimately Muslim. It needs to escape and run to the hills somewhere, and convert the Armenians or somebody in order to have survived. So it would have needed to do something more than just not get destroyed in Jerusalem. Paul Emsley, thank you for your support. Ron Wagner, did Paul have any visions other than on the road to Damascus? So Paul doesn't describe that vision as the road to Damascus. The road to Damascus is the Acts version of it. Paul does say that that he had a vision of the risen Christ, and that his understanding came from direct revelation. And he later, as we saw in the in that little passage about the Jerusalem meeting, he even claimed that he went to Jerusalem in response to revelation. So I think that he believed that a lot of his ideas were continually being inspired. So he had a process of speaking in the Spirit, or that he considered to be revelatory. So whether or not you consider that to be a vision, he considers that to be, there's some kind of a divine inspiration or revelation in Paul's estimation of what's going on. Christian Skaggs says, in terms of visions of the risen Christ, what other visions do we know from Scripture, and are they similar to certain visions? Furthermore, what about non-canonical visions? Well, lots of prophets in the Old Testament describe visions. Some of these are literary prophets, but some of these are actual historical prophets who are talking about visions in their own writings. And so that's the difference between that is Paul's kind of very concise statement that that the risen Christ had appeared to him is different from the three different ways that the story is told literarily by the author of Acts, the Road to Damascus story, which is much more elaborated. In the same way, we'll have in the Old Testament, there might be a fairly simple vision of something that a prophet sees in their own writings, but then when you have a literary story like Daniel, which is written centuries later, and so the vision is the creation of the author, there'll be these very elaborated dreams with multiple beasts that are coming out of the sea, or a statue that has all of the different parts to it, or a stone that is being carved out, of a wall without hands. So some of these rich visions are literary, and so they're a little different from that. In terms of non-canonical visions, people throughout all of history describe visions, both Christian and non-Christian. So it's just a matter of reading through all ancient and medieval and even now early modern contemporary writers. So visionary experience is something that is well attested. So how do we understand it is the question, and also how, and from a religious standpoint, from my standpoint, is how do we respond responsibly to spiritual experiences. And so my feeling about it usually is that if you are seeing them, as very literal and very authoritative in a way, that can end up being a real problem. If it is something where you're having a block in life and something changes, in the same way like with Paul, this road to Damascus moment, as we call it, and you aren't, that can actually be a very positive spiritual experience and response to a spiritual experience. Alyssa says, why is James less important for modern Christians than other, arguably less important church leaders? So because of Mark, the author of Mark, who downgrades James and the other members of Jesus' family, Mark creates this 12 apostles list that James is left off of. I guess he's also off of it in the Paul's list too. So maybe he's not. So we started to have this emphasis of the 12 as being super important, and so that's why maybe James is not thought of as being as an early church leader, even though he clearly was an important early church leader. The emphasis is that I'd say it's because he's left out of the gospel accounts. So he's not in the Gospels, and so that's why he's not seen as important, because modern Christians tend to focus on Scripture rather than history. Mike R. says, many fragments of Christianity from the start. Why didn't these groups, James and Peter, have more writings? Since James was leader longer than Jesus, why was he not deified upon death? So for example, James and Peter and Jesus don't have writings, presumably because they are coming from a very humble origin. So Peter is described as being, a fisherman. Jesus is described as being a carpenter. This would be like a woodworker person, so not somebody who is it's not a wealthy developer and not a guy who owns a fishing fleet or something like that. These are regular working class people, effectively within the vast amount of peasantry, where in an era where literacy is a high elite skill, that it requires that's why there's an entire class that's mentioned all the time in the New Testament, the class of the scribes. And so they didn't leave writings because it was an oral transmission society. So Jesus' sayings, for example, are even designed to be shared and remembered and spread through oral tradition as opposed to through writing. And so that's why they're not doing it. That's why Paul, one of the reasons why, as we went in our counter lecture to this James lecture, the Paul lecture, why Paul's church is one, the fact that Christianity, or even before it's even called Christianity, converted a guy who had this, who is trained in Greek rhetoric, who had this kind of scribal writing capacity, who had a staff that allowed him to eventually produce a pretty significant literary output. That's one of the reasons why he won. In terms of James not being deified, so again, because the prism through which modern Christians see this early time period is through Paul's lens, and Paul is so focused on the deification of Jesus, it's probably different from how the Jacobite church, the community that fled Jerusalem to Pella, was probably seeing things. So they might have been seeing James as just as an important, almost, a martyred prophet as John the Baptist, as Jesus, as James, who, like you say, was a leader for much longer. To the extent that they were already, though, thinking of Jesus as the Messiah, that's the reason also why Jesus ends up being more deified than John the Baptist, or just an important prophet like Moses and Elijah, or John the Baptist, or James, the brother of Jesus. The Messiah now takes on special connotations, especially as Christianity comes to terms with how do we understand monotheism and the Messiah as divine. Okay. JC, thank you for your support. Hermes, thrice great, thank you for your support. Just for fun, TVV says, why do you think Thomas and Judas are made into villains in the conventional Bible? I think they were right about some things, and some things that were to remain secret within the human realm. Yeah, so in that sense, when we're reading all of the literature that the different communities produced, different modern people have different sensibilities, and there are a lot of people who have a lot of sympathies for Judas. There was a gospel that's also written from the perspective of Judas that justifies Judas, and like you say, has a different perspective than the conventional one. Why do I think that they were villains in the conventional Bible? The conventional one is promoting the apostolic leadership of Peter, James, and John. It's wanting to say that the communities that have these different perspectives, especially about, like you're talking about, teachings that maybe should be kept secret within the human realm, they are very skeptical of that and want to deny that there is any such secret teachings, and so they want to make sure that Thomas isn't a vessel for some kind of secret teachings that the alternate communities are claiming his authority to know. K. Tempest Bradford asks, is it implied that James set Paul up? I don't think it's implied in Acts. I think Acts is trying very clearly to say, nope, he didn't. It was some other Jews from Asia Minor, that are made to be the blame. But I'm saying it's possible that James set Paul up. We can't know. All we have is Acts Acts account of this, and Acts is saying what happened to him, and we can read into it that maybe if that is what happened, maybe it is James set him up because they were having this pretty major fight and had been, according to Paul, all of this time. Kaiwan F8 says, why did it take 4 years for Paul to be executed? So there were different layers of Roman administration. And so Paul is in the province here. He goes to Caesarea where he's being held. He eventually, according to, so we lose out on Paul's letters, so we don't have letters where he's explaining it. The tradition has it in Acts that Paul is able to claim or is able to assert that he is an actual Roman citizen, which is possible. It's a rare condition to be, but it was a special condition. And that once he asserted that, then he was able to appeal his trial all the way to Rome so that he could have it set there. And according again to tradition, that on the way, that he's had a shipwreck and so on. So it took a while for the trial to actually happen. And so we don't have the actual account, though, of the final trial and execution anywhere. And so that is all part of tradition. Normative. James is mostly MIA during the Gospels, but then suddenly is leading the movement in like Acts chapter 15. Is the prevailing view is that he swooped in after Jesus' death, or might he have been involved earlier but omitted from the Gospel accounts for political reasons? So my view is that I think he probably was involved earlier, but I don't know. You can't say. So maybe what happened was he wasn't involved. Maybe there's this saying that we have attributed to Jesus that a prophet is not accepted in his hometown, and so maybe Jesus' family was dubious of him, but then James had a vision of the risen Christ, and that changed his mind, and he joined the movement. We can't know because we don't have any source on that or what could have happened. So we could argue that Mark, for whatever reason, his community wants to discredit the Jacobite church, and so therefore he really goes all out to do a smear job on James and to pull him out of the gospel, and that ends up, because of Mark's influence on the other gospels, that ends up having that be the case. Or again, maybe all we know is what Paul says is that James also had a vision of the risen Christ, so maybe he hadn't been involved, and that's what caused him to change his mind the way Paul did. That's totally speculative, all of that. Tyre talks too much. Is Simon Magus Paul? So there are some possibilities there. There are, we need to go and look at exactly what the text says, but there are definitely other texts that are anti-Pauline, and so some parallels can potentially be drawn. So we would have to look exactly there. Yeah, I haven't read it either. So, but there's like a pseudo-Clementine. So anyway, so I'd say no, but anyway, but I would like to want to look at what they're actually trying to get at there. So we'll say tentatively no. So, Unrecognized Talent asks, is it known if James the Just or the poor of Jerusalem had any of their own letters? So if they don't have them, so they had like potentially had letters of recommendation that is saying that this apostle is authorized by James and the pillars of the church in Jerusalem, but they don't have any teaching letters, like Paul's letters. So the only ones that, the earliest letters that we have are these letters that are written in the names of James and Jude and Peter, which are not written by James, Jude, and Peter. Magic L says, could James' insistence on Jewish Christians be explained by pressure from Jewish leaders in Jerusalem as a matter of practicality. I mean, yeah, I mean, in some ways, yes. I mean, it could be. They've just have also always just understood it that way. And so, yeah, they have never, if you just have continued to be a Jewish Christian the way Jesus was and everybody had been, and when Jesus died, your community is still in Jerusalem and you're continuing to do all the same things that you had done before Jesus died, and then this guy who's out planting Christian communities first in Arabia, and then in Syria and Cilicia, and finally in Anatolia and Greece and Macedonia. And he keeps on saying you don't have to adhere to Jewish law, and you're like, well, of course you do. So you could just see that it's a perspective that they aren't seeing. They're not out in the Gentile world seeing all of these people who want to convert to Christianity but who don't want to get circumcised. They don't want to adhere to Jewish law. But on the other hand, they are also much more firmly entrenched in the Jerusalem system. And so tradition has that James continues to be able to participate in the temple, right? So even though Christianity is kind of emerging as its own religion, it's still a sect of Judaism. They're still focused on Jerusalem, at least in James's community. And again, according to tradition, he's still participating within the Jewish components of the temple. So I would say that there's a matter of practicality there too, like you're saying. So there are only 18 more likes, and then we're going to reach 200 likes already on this video. And if you remember, the YouTube algorithm shows the video to more people every time you like and share it. So thank you so much that we already have so many, and 18 more, and we reach 200. Imran Makani says, did Paul preach that Jesus resurrected in the flesh, or that he took on a new spiritual body? So yeah, Paul believes that the resurrection is that you have a new spiritualized. It's a resurrected flesh with a new spiritualized body. So it's a resurrection of the flesh but your body is now perfected. So it's physical resurrection as opposed to an entirely spiritual idea, I think, for Paul. So we should do a whole thing on that because there are competing ideas, and Paul is influenced by I think some of the Greek ideas, but he is also seeing, he's a literalist in some senses, an apocalypticist. He is seeing the raising of the dead, that Christ being raised from the dead, as a sign that the end times are going to happen in his own lifetime. And that's why he actually makes the point when he's talking about all of those visions that people have of the risen Christ or seeing the risen Christ. He says 500 men and women saw Jesus at one time. And many of them are still alive, although some have died. So in his thinking, he kind of feels like all of us really who are seeing this, we're really here at the end, in the end times, the last days. And so most of us are going to live to see Christ return in glory. And so he's obviously very wrong about that, since they've all died. Long time ago. So, okay, 207 likes. You guys did it. Thank you so much. Daryl Scott, why would the Gospel of Thomas say to follow James when James died before that was written? So the tradition, the Gospel of Thomas as we have it has been added to and has been edited and redacted, has had statements added, has had statements edited. But there's probably an earlier collection of sayings inside of it. And so this James saying might date to a much earlier, it might be preserving a much earlier saying than the later compilation that is focusing on apostles like Thomas and Mary Magdalene. So it might be preserving an earlier sayings collection when the earlier compiler was more pro-James than the later compiler, and they just inherited that as a saying. And so it does seem to be at odds with the rest of the gospel, which doesn't say anything about James. So in its present form, it's really focusing on Thomas especially, and then Mary Magdalene is also thought of as being a good one of the enlightened apostles. Hermes Thrice Great says, on what evidence does the Catholic tradition claim that James was a cousin of Jesus when the text clearly says brother? So you can interpret brother. We know that the text also uses the word brother for your brother in Christ. So we can be brothers and sisters in Christ when we don't have any biological relationship. And so that argument can also be made. An argument can be made that they use words like brother when they're talking about more distant relatives like cousins. So I was just talking to I have a lot of cousins, but one of my cousins happens to be named James. I consider him to be a second brother to me. I have one brother, Ben, and then I consider James to be like a second brother because he spent a lot of time. He came and worked for me right out of college, and we spent all kinds of time together. And so just have had a closer relationship with him than I've had with a lot of my other cousins, and so that would be an example. And so there could be an expansive or non-literal understanding of the word brother. Why? Catholics also became very excited about the idea of Mary also living an entirely sinless life, and Mary not only being a virgin when Jesus is born, but for the rest of her life. And so even the doctrine in Catholicism of the Immaculate Conception is not that Jesus is conceived immaculately, but that Mary is conceived immaculately without sin. And so they don't want to have an idea that Mary has other children, And so another explanation for this is to try to make James be another child of Joseph, not of Mary, so that Mary can be kept a virgin perpetually, infinitely. I don't think that was that tradition comes later. So I think that's a concern that develops as the Christian idea of of Mary becomes more theologically significant over time. Apollonius asks, what are your thoughts concerning the brothers and sisters of Jesus? Were they born by Mary after Jesus' birth, or are they stepbrothers and sisters of Jesus previously by Joseph? There's no, it's not described how it works. So my feeling about it is that, so even though, let's say the Gospel of James, the Proto-Evangelion, the infancy Gospel, claims that James was a brother of Jesus who was already alive by the time Jesus was born. So it was by Joseph and a previous wife. So Joseph was a widower when he married Mary, and he already had all these sons and daughters. In that understanding, that's a later tradition in an apocryphal book. I would be just as I'm not myself theologically concerned about the perpetual virginity of the historical Mary or anything like that. And because James lived for such a long time after Jesus' death, my basic idea personally is that it would just be a son born to Mary, potentially by Joseph, after Jesus was born. So a younger brother of Jesus by Mary and Joseph. But again, I don't have any. There's nothing. That would just be my basic take on it. But I don't have. It's not known. It's just all speculative. Apollonius, what are your? Oh, you just said that. You just asked that. I just answered that. Okay, next, Michelangelo. in what sense was Paul persecuting James's church? And under whose authority? Was he literally arresting them, arguing against them in public, or something different, and why? So Paul doesn't actually say that. He says that it was kind of well known that he was doing that. And he said that later, once he had converted, that it delighted the church, the Christians in Judea, that he had converted, and the person who had been persecuting them was now actually himself a missionary for spreading the gospel. There's some description of it in Acts, which, again, I feel like Acts. I'm hesitant to think of Acts as fully historical, but so it's an early tradition, is what I would say. So we don't really know what he's doing and under whose authority. He's in Damascus, so he isn't directly interacting with the church in Jerusalem. So there's an existing Christian community as it's been spreading around by the different apostles who are speaking in the Spirit. Paul, who is a Pharisee, has some kind of he's going to have some kind of authority to enforce Jewish tradition that is allowing him to do some kind of, whether the persecution is simply going up and like arguing against people, condemning them, going those kind of things, or whether he's actually that may well be what it is, as opposed to actually being empowered to physically arrest them. Maybe he's able to shame them, kick them out of the synagogues. It's not described what this persecution consists of, so it just left us to speculate about it, or to what the tradition, as it's kind of described in our tradition. Donnie Lee Gringo says, James the Just, the brother of the Lord, acting as the leader of the church in Jerusalem, how does that align with the on this rock idea and the Roman tradition with Peter as the leader? So that idea of on this rock, that is only in the Matthew's gospel. So it's not a multiply tested saying. It is a saying that's unique to the Matthewan material. And so what it would say is that the Matthewan community, which is a community that that adheres to Jewish law. So it includes a lot of sayings and understandings in support of that Christians have to continue to adhere to Jewish law. So there's other sayings within the Matthewan community that are also in favor of that. So it's a Jewish Christian community that's producing it. Nevertheless, it's being written after James is dead and gone. And so now that community, anyway, the Matthewan community, has been looking to a different Jacobite leader, Peter, as important. And so they are remembering a tradition that Jesus gave keys to Peter to be the leader, because James is now gone. So that's that community's tradition, and then that because of the tradition that Peter goes to Rome, which we don't have very good attestation on at all. We had a whole lecture on Peter and kind of the origins of the papacy, and how kind of shaky the connection to actually get to historical Peter in Rome is anyway. That ends up though being, for the bishops of Rome when they do emerge, that ends up being a scripture that they find is very important and pivotal. And that's why that's like that. So, thank you very much. In closing, don't forget to like and share this video. Appreciate everybody who's already pressed like. If you want to, please subscribe to our channel. If you're able, you can also consider a donation, centerplace.ca/donate. And next week, we're going to look at contradictions in the Bible, biblical texts that argue against each other, starting with my favorite book in the Old Testament, Ruth, versus Ezra, which you can tell which side of this fight I'm going to be on. Ezra, not my favorite book. So, see you next week.